Hey guys, Movie Wiz here. In today's video, I will be telling you the story of the mystery thriller, I Still See You. Spoilers ahead. Enjoy the video. This film focuses on the world 10 years after an apocalyptic event that claimed the lives of millions of people and left others to roam the world as ghost-like versions of themselves called remnants. When Veronica, a high school student, realizes that a remnant is determined to kill her, she teams up with her classmate Kirk to uncover the remnant's plan before it's too late. The film begins with the protagonist Veronica, or Ronnie as everyone calls her, narrating what occurred on the day of the event. In the past, we see a group of young students and their teacher in a classroom as a little girl goes to the window and sees an explosion in the distance. Chaos erupts all around the city as the little girl runs with her mother while seeing the sky become overcast with the blue tint of the explosion. 10 years later, we see Veronica all grown up having breakfast with her mother as the TV plays in the background, showcasing a press conference that discusses the possibility of new remnants. Veronica's father appears to be sitting at the table, but he soon fades away, indicating that he is a remnant. Ronnie abruptly leaves for school, quite annoyed that her mother refuses to acknowledge her dead father's presence. As Ronnie rides to school on her bicycle, she continues to provide narration about the events, saying that many people are gone, but a piece of them is left behind, which is referred to as remnants. These ghost-like versions of people can be seen by everyone and exist in everyday life. Veronica further says that there was an explosion at a government facility called Ashburn Laboratories, which turned the persons in its path into remnants, who although appear to be present are not. At school, Veronica sits in class as her teacher, Mr. Bittner, explains his views on remnants, which have become quite the topic of conversation. He also discusses the 3 laws of remnants, stating that remnants are not conscious, thinking beings, but projections of the past. A student speaks about the second law, which states that once remnants appear, they do the same thing every time, stuck in a time loop that never varies. During class, Veronica stares at a boy who appears to scribble something very intently in his notebook. Veronica seems to be in a daze looking at this boy until she is interrupted by Mr. Bittner, inquiring about the third law. Veronica then states that remnants cannot affect our natural world, to which the teacher agrees. Veronica shows her classmates that more remnants are appearing as one sits in a classroom, which spooks the entire class until it floats away. The bell then rings and everyone scrambles out of class, but Veronica is held back by Mr. Bittner due to a bad grade in his class, which he knows Ronnie will improve. At lunch, Veronica's friend tells her about Kirk, the guy Ronnie couldn't stop staring at. Ronnie's friend says that Kirk is obsessed with remnants and was expelled from his former school and even ended up in a mental hospital. That night, Ronnie goes ice skating and reminisces about the time she spent with her father as he patiently taught her how to ice skate. This causes Ronnie to feel quite sad but comforted as she remembers that her dad said that he would always be there for her. The next day, as Ronnie finishes taking a shower, she is shocked to see a man standing in front of her. Ronnie screams in fright and falls out of the bathtub, hitting her head. The man, who appears to be a remnant, slowly disappears in front of the mirror, leaving behind the word run. At school, Ronnie sits in class but is distracted as she thinks about the remnant she saw that morning. Upon noticing that the entire class is staring at her, Ronnie realizes that her ear is bleeding. Although she thinks it's nothing, Mr. Bittner invites Ronnie to his house that evening and is keen to answer any questions she has. Later that day, now at Mr. Bittner's house, Ronnie asks if remnants can communicate due to what she saw in the mirror this morning. However, Mr. Bittner assures her that remnants can't communicate with people, implying that Ronnie may have a concussion. Back at home that evening, Ronnie waits in the bathroom to see if another message will appear but sees nothing. The following day, Ronnie goes into town and follows Kirk, her classmate from school. Ronnie continues to follow him to an abandoned entrance as Kirk suddenly appears behind her, demanding to know why she is following him. Ronnie explains her dilemma about the remnant she saw in her bathroom, saying that she's never seen this remnant before. Ronnie then walks with Kirk into this abandoned entrance as he tells her, "Get ready." Suddenly, little remnants of fish float past them, and Ronnie is both shocked and surprised at what she is seeing, realizing that Kirk is more interested in remnants than she thought. Ronnie discovers that, similar to her, Kirk has more questions about the remnants and doesn't believe everything he's been told. Ronnie tells Kirk that she thinks this remnant wants to hurt her and begs for his help. Although Kirk initially declines, he agrees when Ronnie says that she will help him with a project they both have to work on. From here on, the two of them try to decipher what exactly this remnant wants. While conversing with Kirk, Ronnie subconsciously calls the remnant Brian, stating that this name just appeared in her mind. Kirk and Ronnie then talk with another student in hopes of catching the remnant on camera. The student, Chandler, agrees to help when Ronnie agrees that he can tell people that they had intercourse. With Chandler's help, Kirk and Ronnie get the supplies they need to capture a photo of Brian. That night, they use a black light in Ronnie's bathroom, hoping to see Brian, with Ronnie being certain that Brian will show up. Upon hearing a creaking noise, Ronnie ventures downstairs into the dark house, looking through the hallways as a clock ticks in the background. Someone suddenly runs past Ronnie and she sprints back to the bathroom to get Kirk's help. The two of them slowly walk downstairs, Kirk armed with one of Ronnie's skates, the sharp bottom of the skate sticking up in the air. However, they mistakenly attack Ronnie's mother in the darkness, and Ronnie quickly introduces her mother to Kirk. Given that Ronnie is sure that Brian will show up at 6:30 p.m., she races back to the bathroom with Kirk. Although beyond terrified, Kirk and Ronnie manage to capture a picture of Brian, who looks in the mirror as his face starts to break apart and the lights in the bathroom begin to shake. Brian then turns around, ready to grab Ronnie when the lights go out and the remnant disappears, leaving both Kirk and Ronnie very confused. The next day, Kirk brings a newspaper to school, showing Ronnie that Brian is a killer who is suspected of abducting and murdering Pastor Greer's daughter, Mary. Later that day, Ronnie and Kirk visit a monument that showcases the names of the fallen people, which are all the people whose lives were lost on the day of the event. Next, they visit Pastor Greer, who informs Kirk and Ronnie that Brian stalked her daughter at school. Brian then approached Mary before they got into an argument. Pastor Greer says that Mary was last seen with Brian before she was murdered. The day after Mary was found, the police found Brian in a motel room, having committed suicide by shooting himself. Kirk and Ronnie decide to do more research at a nearby library, trying to figure out how Brian knew Mary and, most importantly, Brian's connection to Ronnie. Ronnie notices that Mary's age on the articles is different, as she went missing the day before her birthday, but when she was found, it was already past her birthday. We then discover that Mary was born on February 29th, which is also Ronnie's birthday. Suddenly, the lights start to flicker and eerie voices whisper in the background as the librarian suddenly informs them that the library is closing soon. They are about to leave when Ronnie realizes that she has been writing the word "run" over and over in her notebook, but she doesn't remember writing it. In the next scene, we see Kirk being questioned by Principal Pescatelli about visiting Pastor Greer and inquiring about Mary's death. Principal Pescatelli is adamant that if Kirk doesn't tell the truth, he could be expelled. At a school basketball game, Ronnie talks with her friend who warns her about Kirk, but Ronnie insists that Kirk is a good person. Suddenly, a glimpse of fear appears on Ronnie's face as she sees Brian in the audience. Walking towards him, she discovers that the person wasn't Brian as she turns her attention back to the game. Brian keeps appearing as Ronnie begins to walk through the basketball game as the players continue to move around her. A stream of whispering voices around Ronnie intensifies when Principal Pescatelli suddenly falls through the roof, right in front of Ronnie. The students gather around the principal's body, terrified and confused as the principal's blood spills onto the basketball court. That night, Kirk shows up at Ronnie's house admitting that he told the principal about Brian. Kirk insists that the principal did not commit suicide and becomes suspicious of the situation. Kirk then tells Ronnie that he believes Principal Pescatelli is dead because he knew about Brian. In her room that night, Ronnie discusses the last moment she spoke with her father when she was 6. That day, Ronnie was being a difficult child, and because of this, her father was late and took his car to work instead of riding on the train. By doing this, Ronnie's father was severely affected by the explosion on the day of the event and died. Now, Ronnie's father exists as a remnant. We'd also learn that the skate which Kirk was using to defend himself belonged to Ronnie's father. With tears in her eyes, Ronnie blames herself for her father's death, saying that she has never been to her father's grave. The two of them begin to bond over this subject as Kirk admits that he's so interested in remnants, as he wants to know why his dead father has never shown up as a remnant. Kirk states that what scares him the most is that his father died, but he is still alive, as he questions the significance of his father's death. Looking into each other's eyes, Kirk leans in to kiss Ronnie, but is interrupted by Ronnie's mother suddenly opening the door. Ronnie's mother invites Kirk to spend the night, stating that she made up the sofa for him to sleep downstairs. That night, Ronnie lays in bed, remembering the day of the event, but upon seeing her window open, she quickly closes it when she sees Brian in the reflection, who reaches out to grab her. Ronnie appears to be dreaming as the floor cracks beneath her, causing her to fall into the water below. In her dream, Ronnie sees a girl swimming towards her, as well as a series of other images and a long stretched highway. The next morning, Ronnie wakes up in a sweat and her mother informs her that she kept repeating "darkness falls" in her sleep. Ronnie's mother then tells her to close the window and come downstairs for breakfast. Downstairs in the kitchen, Ronnie's mom states that due to a job interview, she may miss Ronnie's birthday on February 29th, but insists that they can still celebrate Ronnie's special day. Kirk sits with Ronnie at the table for breakfast and is amazed to see the remnant of Ronnie's dad sitting at the head of the table. Kirk realizes that the date on his newspaper reflects 8 years ago, which is odd since Ronnie's dad passed away 10 years ago. Kirk is certain Ronnie's dad is trying to warn her, as the names of 2 murder victims, Emma Shaw and Claire White, appear in the newspaper. These 2 girls were both murdered on February 28th, 1 year apart from each other. Later that day, Kirk and Ronnie visit Claire's sister at a diner, who informs them that Claire had a boyfriend named Brian. Claire's sister says that Claire was obsessed with Brian and moved to Chicago after a few weeks to be with him. Claire's sister then states that Kirk and Ronnie can view Claire's murder, but tell them to be careful, as to do this, they must enter the no-go zone. As we've seen, Kirk and Ronnie are very determined and so drive to the no-go zone, which is restricted and is only to be used by authorized U.S. personnel. It seems that many remnants occupy this area, and as Kirk and Ronnie get out of the car, they begin to hear whispering voices all around them. Ronnie notices the sign "darkness falls," which she was repeating during her dream. Upon cutting through a large fenced area, Kirk and Ronnie walk through the abandoned streets, surrounded by remnants who are the only inhabitants of this area. Walking among the remnants, Kirk says that their loops are continuous as they are closest to ground zero. The city is overrun with remnants who continue to live their lives all over again. Slowly, Kirk and Ronnie continue to move, but upon seeing a group of locals, Kirk kisses Ronnie to distract them, which works. Kirk and Ronnie finally arrive at Ashburn Laboratories, the location where Claire was murdered. The pair encounter a strange man whom they pay money to for a chance to view Claire's death. He instructs them on where to go, and Kirk and Ronnie begin to walk through a dark hallway as they see remnants throughout different years. Going to any area with many other spectators, Kirk and Ronnie see Claire begin to fight an unseen person in a white dress as she struggles to get up the stairs. Claire is then strangled by this unknown person, as we hear the sound of her bones breaking. Upon seeing Claire's gruesome murder, Kirk and Ronnie are about to leave when they come across Dr. Steiner, who owned Ashburn Laboratories. Kirk and Ronnie chase after him, finally catching up to him, but Dr. Steiner isn't interested in talking and aims a gun at Kirk and Ronnie. Terrified, Ronnie begs for answers, demanding to know the truth. Dr. Steiner then takes Kirk and Ronnie back to a small room and begins to explain himself. Dr. Steiner states that through death, people leave pieces of themselves behind. Therefore, the dead can create a doorway to communicate with the living. Dr. Steiner further says that the focus of his research was the creation of a doorway between life and death, but this became quite dangerous. Unfortunately, instead of creating this doorway between life and death, it led to the occurrence of the event. We learned that Brian was Dr. Steiner's research assistant, and after the event, something changed in him. Dr. Steiner is sure that Brian killed Mary, and since Brian killed the person he loved most, he is trying to bring them back in the body of someone else. Dr. Steiner doesn't agree with the laws of remnants, stating that Brian can only succeed if the vessel, which in this case is Ronnie, shares a birthday with the deceased. During this talk, Kirk sees a picture on the floor and quickly places it in his pocket, showing that his years of work have affected him. Dr. Steiner tells Kirk and Ronnie that nothing is as it seems before he shoots himself, leaving Ronnie and Kirk traumatized. At school, Kirk tries to come up with a plan to keep Ronnie safe, since Brian will come after her on her birthday. In an unexpected turn of events, Kirk is asked to open his locker, and inside, a member of the staff finds a gun and Kirk is pulled away down the hall. However, he shouts in the distance, telling Ronnie that the gun isn't his. With nowhere else to turn, Ronnie goes to Mr. Bittner, who believes her about Brian and tells her that Kirk was expelled from his last school because they found a gun in his possession. That night, at Mr. Bittner's house, Ronnie tells her teacher about what Dr. Steiner said, and Mr. Bittner insists that they must keep Ronnie safe for the next 24 hours. Mr. Bittner tells Ronnie that they'll use a panic room, which will ensure Ronnie's safety. Kirk shows up at Ronnie's house the next day since she hasn't been answering his calls. Upset, Ronnie demands to know the truth as to the reason why Kirk was expelled from his last school. Kirk says that although he had the gun, he had planned to use it on himself, begging Ronnie to believe him, but she simply walks away with tears in her eyes. With the help of Mr. Bittner, Ronnie covers the panic room with lead lining, which will disrupt structural energy, ensuring that Brian will have a harder time getting through. Meanwhile, through some research on his computer, Kirk discovers that Mr. Bittner was a part of Dr. Steiner's research team, and now panicked runs out of the house, trying to call Ronnie. In the next scene, we see Jessica's mom attending her job interview, only to discover that her potential employer had never contacted her. We then follow Kirk speeding over to Mr. Bittner's house, seeing his daughter from the outside. Looking through the house, we see Mr. Bittner's daughter screaming before she suddenly fades away. Kirk then realizes that she is a remnant and died during the event. On the day of the event, Mr. Bittner instructed his daughter to go to the bunkers, but there wasn't enough time, which resulted in her death at the laboratory. Mr. Bittner suddenly appears behind Kirk and knocks him to the ground with a shovel. We then discover that it was Mr. Bittner who called Jessica's mom about the job interview so she would be out of town. Kirk awakes to Mr. Bittner attempting to bury him alive, shoving dirt on him in the process, as Kirk coughs, struggling to breathe. Back in the panic room, Ronnie realizes that Mr. Bittner was the one who strangled Claire and the other women. A terrified expression appears on Ronnie's face as she knows that she is stuck in a panic room with the real killer. It is revealed that Mr. Bittner was murdering these women in hopes of bringing his daughter back. Ronnie then runs from the panic room but is thrown onto the floor, angrily shouting at Mr. Bittner, saying that she trusted him. It is then revealed that Mr. Bittner killed Brian and Principal Pescatelli when they found out the truth. Mr. Bittner even planted the gun in Kirk's locker, saying that he can't bear to see his daughter die again and again. Ronnie manages to cut Mr. Bittner's face with her father's skate and escapes, running out of the house with Mr. Bittner following her. Ronnie comes to a frozen lake and slowly begins walking on it until Mr. Bittner appears behind her, placing her in a chokehold. Ronnie stomps on the ice, leading the two of them to fall into the water below, similar to what we saw in Ronnie's dream. Mr. Bittner seems to be gaining the upper hand as he tries to strangle Ronnie. However, Mary Greer's remnant appears and begins to pull Mr. Bittner further into the water and drowns him. On the other hand, Brian's remnant saves Ronnie, pulling her to the surface. Ronnie then thanks Brian before he disappears. Ronnie tries to crawl out of the ice but struggles, placing her head onto the ice, remembering the time spent with her father and her love for Kirk. Ronnie then sees her dad, telling her that she needs to let go. Although she is scared, Ronnie's dad says that she'll always have a piece of him in her heart. Kirk then appears, pulling Ronnie from the freezing water, placing his coat around her. Kirk tells Ronnie that his dad saved him by digging him out of the grave, saying that his remnant was here all along as we hear the sound of sirens in the distance. Sometime later, we see Ronnie and her mother having breakfast, and Ronnie states that Brian never came back. Ronnie finally visits her dad's grave, expressing her love for him and placing his skate in front of the grave. Ronnie bids him goodbye and walks with Kirk back to his car. Although Ronnie and Kirk think that no one will believe them, they are both adamant that they have to find a way to tell everyone the truth as they smile at each other. The movie ends with the remnant of Mr. Bittner eerily watching Ronnie and Kirk as they get into the car. And there you have it. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more movie recaps like this. Good night.